The sun hung low over the city of Sacramento, California, casting streaks of gold and amber across the quiet suburban streets. The day was winding down, the air was calm, and most people were heading home, eager to put their work behind them. Among them was Eric Porter. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, he sat behind the wheel of his sedan, driving home after a long, demanding day. The soft hum of the engine and the faint melody from the radio filled the cabin. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel as he adjusted the air conditioning, letting out a slow breath. A moment of peace. But that peace was about to be shattered. Just as he slowed at a yellow light, preparing to stop, the unmistakable glare of red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror. Eric's gaze flickered to the mirror, his brows furrowing slightly. He was sure he had slowed down in time. Nevertheless, without hesitation, he signaled, pulled over, and brought his car to a complete stop at the side of the road. He had done this before. He knew how it worked. As he rolled down his window, the sound of a car, door slamming shut, echoed behind him. A man in his mid-30s, with a buzz cut and a crisp police uniform, strode toward the car with the kind of confidence that came from years of authority. His badge gleamed under the setting sun, but his eyes held something colder, a silent assumption, an expectation. This wasn't just about a traffic violation. Larson adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and stopped just outside the driver's window. License and registration. His voice was clipped, firm, not a request, but a command. Eric, ever composed, nodded slightly, reaching into the glove compartment with slow, deliberate movements. If there was one thing he had learned over the years, it was to never make sudden moves. He retrieved his registration, pulled out his driver's license, and handed them both over. Larson took the documents but didn't immediately look at them. Instead, his gaze lingered on Eric, scrutinizing him, as if searching for something. After a moment, he finally spoke. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Eric met his gaze evenly, his tone calm yet firm. "I'm not entirely sure, officer." Larson gave a short, sharp nod, tapping the license against his fingers. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light." A flicker of hesitation. Even he didn't sound fully convinced. Eric frowned slightly, but his voice remained measured. "I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." There was no aggression in his words. No defiance. Just control. But to Larson, that control was unsettling. And just like that, what should have been a routine stop was about to become something much bigger. The sudden burst of red and blue lights lit up the dimming sky, reflecting off the rearview mirror. A sharp, unmistakable wail of the siren cut through the quiet hum of the city. Eric Porter didn't panic. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. With a practiced ease, he activated his turn signal, slowed his car, and pulled over to the side of the road. As he put the gear in park, his fingers hovered for a brief second over the window control. Then, with a composed breath, he rolled it down, resting both hands visibly on the steering wheel. He was ready. Officer Bradley Larson stepped out of his patrol car with the deliberate confidence of someone used to being in control. His dark blue uniform was crisp, his utility belt heavy, and his badge polished, yet it wasn't the metal on his chest that gleamed the most. It was the look in his eyes, a gaze that wasn't just authoritative, but expectant. As he strode forward, his boots thudded against the pavement, each step measured, each movement calculated. He reached the driver's side, squared his shoulders, and without so much as a greeting, his first words fell out, sharp and direct. "License and registration." "No, good evening." "No, do you know why I pulled you over?" Just authority, cold and firm. Eric didn't react, not outwardly, at least. With the same deliberate calmness, he nodded slightly, reaching toward the glove compartment slowly, carefully, making sure every move was visible. Nothing sudden, nothing threatening. He retrieved his registration, took his driver's license, and handed them over. Larson took them without so much as a glance, his eyes instead studying Eric, not his documents, but him, as if he were searching for something. Something he had already decided he would find. Finally, Larson flicked his gaze down at the documents in his hand. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" His tone wasn't conversational. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Eric, ever composed, kept his expression neutral. "I'm not entirely sure, officer." Larson gave a short, sharp nod, almost as if he expected that answer. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light." Eric frowned slightly, but his voice remained steady, unshaken. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't argumentative. It was just a fact. And for a split second, something flickered in Larson's expression. Hesitation. Doubt. But just as quickly as it came, it vanished. He wasn't done. Larson shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking as he folded Eric's license between his fingers. His eyes, sharp and assessing, locked onto Eric's once more. And then came the real questions. The ones that had nothing to do with a traffic stop. You're not from around here, are you? Eric tilted his head slightly. I moved here a few months ago. My address is on my license. Larson wasn't looking at the license. He wasn't even listening to the answer. His questions were starting to take on an edge, just enough to make it clear that this wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. Where were you headed in such a hurry? Eric's lips pressed together briefly before he responded. Just going home. His tone was still even, still composed, but the shift in the air was impossible to ignore. Larson's stance changed. His posture squared up just slightly, as if he was now seeing something more. Something suspicious. Something he needed to control. Eric could feel it. He knew exactly what this was. And so far, he had given Larson nothing to justify it. But that wouldn't stop the officer from looking. Because to Officer Larson, Eric Porter wasn't just a driver anymore. He was a question that needed answering. And this was just the beginning. Larson exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing as he tapped Eric's license against his fingers. His stance shifted, feet planted wider, shoulders squared, an unmistakable power move. Then, his voice came, clipped and firm. Step out of the car. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, a flicker of tension, but his face remained unreadable. Composed. Measured. He didn't move. Instead, he met Larson's gaze, his voice calm but questioning. Is there a specific reason for that, officer? A simple request for clarity. A question any citizen had the right to ask. But Larson's expression hardened. He tilted his head slightly, his fingers grazing the holster at his belt, a silent warning. His next words came slow, deliberate. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be. It wasn't an answer. It was a threat. Eric knew this game. He had seen it played out countless times before. And yet, he remained calm, controlled, unshaken. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. As he stepped out, Larson's eyes flicked over him, scanning him from head to toe, looking for something. Anything. Something that would justify what he had already decided. But Eric gave him nothing. Nothing except poise and quiet authority. Larson took a step back, then gestured toward the hood of the car. Hands where I can see them. Eric complied, his movement steady, calculated. He placed his palms flat against the cool metal of his car, his suit sleeves riding up slightly as he did. A breath. A pause. Then, Larson's voice, low, casual, but waited. Just a routine check. We've had incidents around here. Can't be too careful. Eric turned his head slightly, catching Larson's eye. Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? The question landed like a punch. For a fraction of a second, Larson's composure cracked. Just a flicker. A moment of hesitation. Then, just as quickly, he reset himself, masking it with a short, forced smirk. Just doing my job. But Eric saw through it. And Larson knew it. Larson took his time. His gloved hands moved too firmly, too slowly, lingering longer than necessary. This wasn't just a search. It was an assertion of dominance. A silent demand for submission. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He didn't react. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Larson. He was used to control. Used to fear. But Eric Porter? He was in control of himself. And that control made Larson uneasy. Finally, after a long moment, the officer stepped back. He cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. His words, when they finally came, were almost begrudging. You're clean. Eric turned to face him, dusting off his sleeves with a slow, deliberate movement. Then, his eyes locked onto Larson's. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but razor-sharp. Of course I am. The words hung in the air, waited. Not a challenge. Not an accusation. Just a fact. And in that moment, Larson knew this wasn't going to end the way he had expected. Because this man wasn't like the others. And for the first time, Larson felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Doubt. Larson's jaw tightened. His grip on his belt shifted. He wasn't in control of this situation, and he could feel it. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. So, he did what men like him always did when they felt their authority slipping. He pushed harder. His lips curled into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. His voice dipped lower, edged with something taunting. You seem to know the rules a little too well. His eyes flicked down to Eric's polished shoes, back up to his tailored suit. Got something to hide? A challenge. A trap. A bait. Dangled just within reach. But Eric Porter? He wasn't biting. His expression remained calm, unreadable. I believe in transparency, officer. His voice was even, controlled. And I think this conversation could use some. A beat. A pause. Larson's smirk dropped. His patience snapped. You think you're smarter than me? The words came out too fast, too sharp, a knee-jerk reaction. Eric's gaze didn't waver. This isn't about intelligence. A step forward. It's about respect. The air shifted. Larson felt it. And in that moment, he knew he had lost control. He exhaled through his nose, voice calm but firm. I'm reaching for my badge. No need for theatrics. A simple statement. A clear warning. He pulled out a leather wallet, flipped it open, and held it up between them. A gleaming police badge caught the light. A pause. A silence so thick it felt suffocating. Then, the moment that changed everything. Eric's voice was cool. Unshaken. Final. Backhand index pointing right. Eric Porter, head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. The color drained from Larson's face. His smirk vanished. His breath hitched. His eyes darted between the badge and Eric's face, searching for a lie, a trick, anything. But there was nothing. Just the cold, hard truth. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. You're... The words wouldn't come. Eric finished them for him. Yes, I oversee officer conduct. A step closer. That includes you. Larson took an instinctive step back. For the first time that night, he was afraid. The silence stretched between them. Larson stood frozen, eyes still darting between Eric and the badge he never saw coming. His authority had slipped through his fingers. And now Eric held all the power. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. Instead, he spoke with the calm certainty of a man who had already won. The worst part isn't that you pulled me over for no reason. Larson blinked, swallowed hard. It isn't that you escalated the situation without cause. His breath hitched. His grip on his belt tightened, then loosened. The worst part is that you did all of this without even realizing who you were dealing with. Eric took a step forward, voice steady, controlled. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. Another pause, another beat, then the final blow. Because I don't look like the people you respect. The words hit like a hammer. Larson flinched. His mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing to say. Because he knew. He knew Eric was right. Eric watched as Larson's shoulders slumped. The once confident officer, the man who had strutted up to the car full of authority and power, now stood small, exposed. His hand twitched, as if reaching for control that no longer existed. But there was none left to take. Eric didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply extended a hand. Now, you're going to hand me back my documents. His voice was firm, but even. Then you're going to take a step back and think very carefully about what you say next. Larson's fingers trembled as he fumbled with Eric's license and registration. He barely managed to hold onto them as he extended them back. Eric took them without a word, without breaking eye contact. And Larson? Larson took one slow, hesitant step backward. For the first time tonight, he was the one following orders. Eric tucked his documents into his wallet. Then, with one hand on the car door, he turned his head slightly. His voice was lower now, sharper. A final warning. You'll be hearing from me again, Officer Larson. Larson's lips parted, as if to argue, as if to fight back. But he didn't, because he knew. This wasn't over. Eric's next words sealed it. Not as a driver you pulled over, but as the man who will decide whether you deserve to wear that badge. Larson's throat bobbed. He said nothing, did nothing, just stood there, stiff and pale, watching as Eric stepped back into his car, turned the key, and drove away, leaving Larson alone in the fading light, his confidence shaken, his future uncertain. The next morning, Eric Porter didn't just move on. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it would be the first time it wouldn't be ignored. Sitting at his desk in the Internal Affairs Division, Eric pulled up Officer Bradley Larson's record. And what he found, it wasn't surprising. Magnifying glass tilted left multiple complaints. Magnifying glass tilted left allegations of misconduct. Magnifying glass tilted left accusations of racial profiling. Magnifying glass tilted left unprofessional behavior. Each one buried, ignored, labeled as misunderstandings. Not anymore. Eric wasn't here to sweep things under the rug. He was here to pull the rug back. Eric didn't just focus on Larson. He focused on the culture that let Larson thrive. Pushpin, he proposed a full departmental review. Pushpin, he called for stricter accountability and improved officer training. Pushpin, he met with the chief of police to demand real reform. The message was clear. Police Garlight, this stops now. Police Garlight. No more quiet discipline. No more we'll handle it internally. It was time to be loud. Larson was summoned for a disciplinary hearing. For the first time in his career, he was the one under scrutiny. And this time, he couldn't look away. He couldn't deflect. He couldn't hide behind his badge. Sitting across from Eric Porter, Larson squirmed under the weight of every question. Every past complaint. Every past action. Every moment he had once dismissed as harmless. Now, it wasn't harmless anymore. The verdict? Suspended. His future? Uncertain. For the first time, Larson had to face the reality of his own actions. Loudspeaker, the community took notice. Loudspeaker, the media picked up the case. Loudspeaker, the police department had no choice but to acknowledge the deeper problem. And when Eric stood before a crowd of officers, city officials, and local residents, he didn't speak of punishment. He spoke of responsibility. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys. His voice resonated through the hall. It's about making sure the people who enforce the law do so with integrity, fairness, and respect. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge we're building here, together. The applause was thunderous. But Eric didn't linger on it. Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning of a better one. Larson lost power. Eric recovered justice. The man who once commanded the government on the street now found himself helpless when faced with responsibility. The uniform that once protected him from the consequences is now what makes him carefully considered. Bradley Larson has abused his strength for many years. But that night, he learned a difficult fact. Small blue diamond, the power does not make you unable to touch. Small blue diamond, the power makes you responsible. And for the first time, he was responsible. Small blue diamond, a regular traffic stop, becomes a catalyst to change. What should be just another traffic stop has become something much bigger. It became a waking call, not only for Larson, not only for the department, but for the entire system. The warning signs have been ignored for a long time. No more reason, no more coverage, no longer looking at another way. Eric Porter didn't only want a battle that night. He burned a movement towards real responsibility, towards better training, towards a police force that really serves people is not only some of them, but all of them. Small blue diamond, last message. When Eric left that night, drove out of the red and blue light, he knew something for sure. Justice is only about punishment. It talks about transparency. It talks about respect. It talks about responsibility. And it did not start with a courtroom. It starts on the street. For each officer, each stop, all choices. Because in the end, the badge does not make you exceed the law. The badge makes you responsible for it. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.